Hello, this time on Sitrep.
Putin said he wanted peace, but his forces continue to fire on Ukraine.
The enemy hit Sumy city center with 2 ballistic missiles.
Russia strikes daily.
Ukraine needs a strong military, and only then can the negotiation process lead to a just and lasting peace.
Now is the critical moment in that war.
The death and destruction in Ukraine has only intensified in the 2 months since Donald Trump unilaterally announced peace talks and in the 1 month since Ukraine offered a 30-day ceasefire. With diplomacy having delivered nothing so far, we explain the current status of the war itself and the potential paths ahead. You heard John Healey just there say this is a critical moment, and allies have just pledged another £18 billion worth of military support. But how much can we influence what ultimately happens? Especially given a German assessment that the newest tanks that it sent are underperforming and could even be a hindrance. We'll get the thoughts of a former British tank commander. What lessons should we be learning for our own army? And which tank would he rather be in?
Sitrep with James Hirst and Professor Michael Clarke.
On Friday, President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, met President Putin in St. Petersburg to talk peace. Less than 48 hours later, on a sunny Sunday morning in the Ukrainian city of Sumy, 2 Russian Iskander ballistic missiles brought death and destruction. At least 35 people were killed and at least 119 injured, including many children. This was the deadliest attack for Ukrainian civilians in well over a year. Of course, diplomacy and fighting can and inevitably do continue side by side, at least for a time. But Mike, Russia's actions just seem to be drowning their words into silence, don't they?
Yes, I mean, the Russians don't want to stop fighting. I mean, always with this balance between fighting and diplomacy, a side will fight for as long as they think they can get more out of fighting, if they're able to, than making a deal. And at the moment, the Ukrainians think they get more out of making a deal. The Russians think they get more out of fighting. And the United States is halfway through a process of changing sides in the war, both strategically and tactically. Strategically, the US is halfway towards changing sides because it doesn't see what is at stake in this war in the way that Joe Biden saw it. It doesn't see it as a war fundamentally to drive back anti-democratic aggression, to drive back naked imperialism. That's the way the Biden administration saw it and the way the Europeans see it. Well, the US doesn't see it in that light. It's not clear quite how they do see it, but they're halfway along a journey, as it were, away from that conception. And tactically, they're also halfway towards changing sides in the sense that the United States have accepted, they're trying to bring Russia to the table on the basis of gains that the Western world would have regarded as completely unacceptable a couple of years ago. Giving Russia a victory, it will be a victory, partial in terms of what the Russians want, but a much bigger victory than anyone would have wanted to give them 2 or 3 years ago. And the United States is halfway towards granting them that victory as a way of just getting it off the desk, as a way of just getting it behind them, because the United States' global ambitions are completely different to the ambitions of previous US governments. So there we are. They're halfway through changing sides in this whole conflict.
But as you say, the US wants this war ended and off the desk. The side they are seemingly switching to backing don't want the fighting over now. And, if we just look at the big picture, I mentioned that missile attack on Sumy, but that's just part of a bigger picture that matches that. From February to March, there was a 50% increase in civilian casualties in Ukraine, according to UN figures. I mean, Mike, there was supposed to be a limited ceasefire that stopped targeting energy infrastructure. Was there any sign of that happening at all?
There was a little bit of restraint on that side, certainly on the Ukrainian side, although the ceasefire was meant to apply to energy infrastructure and related infrastructures. And of course, that's a very flexible term. What is an energy infrastructure? It can be the transport network going into power stations and so on. And the Russians certainly have targeted, that we know of, targeted many energy infrastructure sites in Ukraine. The Russians claim on a daily basis, that the Ukrainians hit 5 sites, energy infrastructure sites, 8 sites some days. Every day they make multiple claims. They never offer any evidence. And those of us in this business have looked for evidence, we can't find it. So we don't think that the Ukrainians are targeting Russian energy infrastructure in any direct sense, though the Russians are occasionally and reasonably regularly targeting Ukrainian ones.
Well, also with us today, Simon Newton, lead reporter on all things Ukraine for Sitrep and BFBS Forces News. Simon, good to see you again. I mean, what Mike and I have just been talking about there, the airstrike in Sumy, or another one again which hit civilians in Kryvyi Rih a few days before. This is all the air war beyond the front lines. Right. You experienced what was happening in terms of that air war back in the autumn when you visited, and we spoke to you about that then. From what you are looking at on a day-by-day basis in terms of tracking this conflict, does your research show an increased intensity in that air war?
Yeah, I mean, we actually stayed in Sumy back in November, about less than two kilometres, I think, from where those Iskanders landed. So it was absolutely devastating to see that happen, because it struck me when we were in Sumy just how people were carrying on with their normal lives despite being obviously so close to the Russian border and that daily bombardment. But I think if you look at the figures and just sort of delve down into them, there's two things going on. There's a quantitative increase in the number of attacks that are going on. I think I saw some figures around 5,000 guided bombs used in March, and that's up from about 3,500 in February. So there's an increase in the actual number going on. They're also particularly the Russians using more Shahed drones, or drones of any description, in each particular attack. So the numbers, I think, were something like 83 drones per attack in January. That's gone up. That's almost doubled in February, and they're also doing things in a slightly different way. They are using the Shaheds and holding them, marshalling them away from the target, and then hitting targets all at once with a number of Shahed drones. They're using more drone decoys, and they're using more drones with missiles. So there seems to be absolutely an increase in the number of drone strikes and the actual number of weapons they're using in each strike. And they're also developing new versions of the Shahed 136, of the Geran 3 as well. So I think it's definitely, not even anecdotally, an increase in the number of attacks, and obviously on these civilian casualties.
And in terms of the air war on Ukraine's side, what are we seeing in terms of Ukrainian strikes behind Russian lines and even into Russian sovereign territory?
Well, they are hitting, as Mike said, facilities inside Russia. They are hitting oil refineries. We saw that big attack in Tatarstan, if you remember, which was about 800 miles inside Russia. They're hitting the weapons factories. They're hitting the drone production sites. And that is an area, I suppose, for Ukraine that is something they are leveraging, and they see some sort of possible gains there. It has a psychological effect, obviously, on the Russian population. They're able to target the logistics chain. They've increased drone production, domestic drone production in Ukraine by 8-fold, I think, in the last year or so. They're bringing on board lots of new systems as well. We've seen the BARS drone missile launched this week. We've got the Peklo, the Palynytsia, if you've seen that, which is a jet-powered sort of drone missile, and obviously the Neptune, which is the long-range anti-ship missile that they used to sink the Moskva, but they've now adapted that to be fired from the ground. So they are, in terms of what they can hit, I think the ISW Institute for the Study of War assessment I saw was that there are about 250 odd sites, key sites within Russia, that are now within range of Ukrainian missiles, and that's obviously includes Storm Shadow and the ATACMS that Joe Biden let them use late last year. And also we heard this week that Friedrich Merz, who's obviously the Germany's Chancellor in waiting, is talking about taking the brakes off Taurus and perhaps letting the Ukrainians use those. So they are definitely seeing, the Ukrainians are definitely seeing these strikes into Russia as an area they can exploit.
Mike, ultimately, if either side wants to carry on fighting, it is presumably the prize is about the ground front lines. It's about the territory, isn't it? And are we seeing, in those 2 months, are we seeing any movement on those front lines?
Well, some, but not all that much. I mean, as Simon said, the intensity of the fighting is increasing all the time. The tempo has gone up as the weather is improving and both sides are bringing forward new systems, but not much is happening on the ground. I mean, the Russians are still making some gains. They've got two objectives, really. One, they're going from Toretsk going towards Kostiantynivka. If they could take that, then they'll push on, one would imagine, to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And if they get Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, then they will control the Donbass. And then a bit further southwest from there, they are still trying to work southwards of Pokrovsk. They still haven't taken Pokrovsk after all this time, but they're trying to work southwestwards as if they could get a breakthrough as far as Dnipro, and they're certainly bombing Dnipro fairly intensively. So they're trying to push, as it were, in the Donbass north, and from the Donbass westwards into Zaporizhia. And then up in the north, in Kursk and opposite Belgorod, the Ukrainians are still holding on to a tiny bit of territory in Kursk, and another bit of territory that they've taken on the Russian side of the border, opposite Belgorod. And all the speculation is whether the Russians are preparing a big counteroffensive up in the north to push down. The Ukrainian intelligence say that the Russians intend to try to surround Sumy and literally cut the city off. I'm not sure if the Russians can do that, but there's certainly something going on up there in the north, opposite Sumy, around the Belgorod area. And as the weather improves by the end of this month, when we know, the weather's very predictable in Ukraine, I mean, as the weather improves, we'll probably see what it is the Russians have got in mind if they intend to try to make a strategic breakthrough in that particular part of the front.
And what you're describing there, Mike, sounds to me like the momentum is very much with Russia.
Yes, it is. I mean, it may not be a high momentum, but insofar as there is momentum, it is with them at the moment. And they certainly seem to believe that it will go their way. And they still seem to be, waiting for a significant strategic breakthrough, but it hasn't happened. And the way they fight is less and less strategic. I mean, they're on their third army now, remember. I mean, they used up their first professional army in about the first year, 18 months of the war. Then they recruited their, 300,000 mobilization. That was their second army. Now they're on their third army, which is a mixture of foreign nationals and mobilized men and contract soldiers and a bit of the old corps. And that third army has fallen back into real old Soviet-style offensives because they haven't got time to train. They're right on the front line. They're trying to learn on the job. And what they learn is real, almost like First World War tactics with 21st century weapons. So I don't think the Russians are capable of fighting a modern combined arms offensive with the army that they've now got. They're less capable now than they were in 2022. But by sheer overwhelming force and bringing more and more foreign troops into the battlefield, they're creating this sort of grinding momentum.
So you say not capable of winning in a modern war context, but equally, is Ukraine capable of reversing that momentum, and what does it need to do, if so?
If it had another tranche of Western weapons of the sort it had in 2023 and used them a bit differently, then a strategic breakthrough in more than one place is possible to envisage. As it stands, I think the Ukrainians, because of their ingenuity and the way they organize themselves and so on, they're capable of defending very well, but reversing this big steamroller momentum in front of them will take more than they've got at the moment. And they do need, I mean, this needs a Western-style army to crack through this sort of deadening hand of an old-fashioned army with very modern weapons, which is what the Russians are now offering. So, can the Ukrainians do it? No, I don't think they can. They can keep on defending competently, but can they reverse the momentum? Not without another big tranche of Western help, and they probably won't get that during this year. If they carry on fighting, it might come in due course. We'll see what happens, but it won't come, this side of the summer.
Okay, well, we'll talk a bit more a bit later about the sort of potential paths forward, and indeed the kit that has just been pledged, the extra kit that's just been pledged by Western nations. But before we do that, I want to look at some lessons seemingly to be learned from a leaked German assessment of some of that equipment that it sent back in 2023, I think it was. A lot of the focus from this assessment, Simon, has been on Leopard 2 tanks, but it is wider than that, isn't it? Just give us an overview of what this assessment says.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting story. So this is the deputy defense attaché to Ukraine, German deputy. He went to Saxony to address some NCOs at their NCO school, spoke to them, the transcript of that conversation. And what he was giving them was the feedback he had from Ukrainian forces about the German kit that's been supplied. And it was pretty damning stuff, really. They were talking about the Leopard 1A5 tanks being under armored, that they're very vulnerable to anti-tank missiles and Lancet drones, Russian missiles. So they've sort of dug those in and used them as sort of artillery. The Panzerhaubitze 2000, this really exquisite bespoke artillery piece that it's overheats and it's got electrical issues. The RST, which is again a world-beating kind of air defense system, that the Ukrainians have said, well, it's great, but we don't have enough missiles, and it's very and when we do get them, they're very expensive. So it is a fairly damning kind of bit of feedback. There was some good stuff in there. The Marder infantry fighting vehicle and the Gepard, the anti-aircraft guns, they've performed well, but they are of a slightly earlier generation of weaponry. So, it's the overall headline was that the German kit that they've given them is not ideal for the kind of war that's being fought in Ukraine. The complexity of it. The lack of field support means the Ukrainian crews can't use it to its fullest, and so it was a very interesting piece. Lots of pretty damning headlines came out of it. But I think I have delved into this, and there's a piece on our website looking at it in a more sort of nuanced way, because there are potentially reasons why that's actually happening.
Yeah, as always, it's a balancing act, and it's about that thing about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. But there are perhaps lessons in this for all of us. And I've been talking to retired Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon. His extensive military career started with more than 15 years in the Royal Tank Regiment, and he thinks those lessons for all of us are not exactly new.
The story of German tanks that we're seeing in Ukraine is virtually exactly the same that we saw in the Second World War, and something that we are guilty as well. German tanks in the Second World War were very sophisticated, very technical, big beasts, and overmatched everything. Even cursory historians will have heard of the Tiger tank, probably the best tank ever made, but it was made in very few numbers, and therein the issue. And it was difficult to maintain. It was a big training bill. You wind forward to today, and Leopard 2 is exactly the same. As you say, it vastly overmatches what Russia has, T-72s and T-80s. It's got a much better gun. The armament's much better. It's got a more powerful engine. But it suffers the same issues that the Germans had in the Second World War. And these are really three issues. First of all, the level of sophistication of the vehicles, be it the Tiger in the Second World War or the Leopard now, means that when they go wrong, they're really difficult to repair. And that's exactly what has been happening. A Leopard is having to move hundreds of miles to be repaired. And if something goes wrong with the engine, they have to take the whole engine out and put a new one in. Now, you look at a Russian tank, a big hammer is probably what you need to repair it. And the first tank I was on, the Chieftain tank, was a 1950s design. But, if the engine stopped or didn't work, you could generally get it going again. You didn't need to take it out. You didn't need to get some specialist. There was one particular thing called the fuel injection pump solenoid that was always breaking. But you knew that if you had a close peg, you could peg this thing open and it would work. It's a similar thing in a Challenger 2 or Leopard. You'd need to move it hundreds of miles, get the engine out and put a new one in. A second issue is the vulnerability of these sort of, they're 4 or 5 million quid a copy, but they've been taken out very easily with drones that cost a couple of $100, dropping explosives into them. Now, when the Leopard 2 and the Challenge 2 were designed and conceived 20, 30 years ago, drones were not an issue. But it's how quickly you can react to new threats and counter them. And bouncing around a bit, in the First World War and the first tanks, a lot of them would be destroyed by Germans throwing sticky bombs or hand grenades onto the top of them. But very quickly, the tankies then realized if you put chicken wire on the top, the grenade would explode before it hit the tank. we're now seeing bar armor on top of Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s, and also the Russian tanks Ukrainians have to do exactly the same thing. But also in the early days in Ukraine, you're seeing very expensive anti-aircraft missiles being used to hit these drones, and it just doesn't compute. So that it's been able to react to threats. And the final piece with this is pure numbers. We're talking about 18 Leopard 2s, we're talking about 14 Challenger 2s. The Russians are talking in thousands. Some figures say the Russians have lost 4,000 tanks. In the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the Russians lost about 4,000 tanks and the Germans a similar number. Now, the mass is still important, and that is a key lesson coming out.
The numbers, we know the difficulty with that, and of course it's worth noting that the Ukrainians have some less advanced tanks in considerably greater numbers. But if we look at those sort of two other problems, let's talk about the vulnerability from above. You can add armor, but that then makes the tank heavier. The bar armor is a partial solution. It's a balancing act here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're talking about now is defensive aid suites. It is in the public domain that Port Down are working very hard on small lasers that could be fitted onto tanks that would fire very cheap lasers to knock down these drones. And that probably seems to be the answer in the long run until the drones have a counter to that. I mean, the other element to this, as you've mentioned, is size. The German and British tanks are so much bigger than the Russian tanks, mainly because a Russian tank only has a crew of 3. Western tanks have 4. Russian tanks have what we call autoloaders, and we don't have them. So we're making the tanks bigger and bigger and bigger, and actually, an easier target. So I think this is a really good lesson. Should we actually be making our tanks smaller and smaller and have defensive aid suites that can counter these things? But this is all expensive stuff, and still, if these tanks can be taken out by $500 drones, it really does change the complexity of the situation.
And this idea that the Leopard 2s are so much greater engineered, that's done to give some kind of advantage when it's working, but of course, as you say, it makes it harder to then repair in the field. Again, it's a balancing act, isn't it? You don't want to just give up that technological advantage if you can have it.
No, absolutely. And, it's really what works. And again, harping back to the Second World War, the Germans only had a couple of thousand tanks, whereas the Allies managed to generate 60,000 Sherman tanks. The Sherman was a very simple, very basic tank, very easy to use. And if you lost them, that was not a problem. I remember a German tank commander saying, well, we've knocked out 7 of your Shermans already. And how are you going to counter that? And the American general said, well, there are another 7 waiting to take its place.
But the counter to that is you don't just lose the tank, which is replaceable, you lose people. And this is what the Russians are experiencing. Yes, their tanks might be lighter, more nimble, and in greater number, but they are losing far more than the Ukrainians are losing.
That's right. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're not training your tank crews to the level that they should be, you're putting partially trained people into tanks, therefore they become more susceptible. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. When I trained as a tank commander, it took about 2 years to get into a position where you were really competent. Some of these Russian tank crews are getting a couple of weeks. But if you can make the training really simple, like on a Sherman or on some other tanks, then life becomes easier, because the sophistication of a Leopard 2 or a Challenger 2, it actually takes quite a long time to work how to use all the various systems.
You mentioned, as I say, the Challenger 2, and we are upgrading to the Challenger 3. I mean, how does that compare in terms of the advantages, disadvantages that we've looked at with Leopard 2, does it have the same complexity of engineering that requires it to be taken out of the field?
Well, it unfortunately it does, and Challenger 3 is whatever the Ministry of Defence might want to say is basically a Challenger 2 sort of GTI version. It'll be interesting to see what the defensive aid suites that they're putting on it, but technically very similar to the Leopard 2. In fact, it's going to have the same gun, the 120 millimeter smoothbore. And the idea with these complex vehicles like Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 was it was components. You would just take out one component, say the engine or whatever, and you put in a new one. Now, that's fine if you've got all the wherewithal to do it. But we're seeing in Ukraine, covering a vast, the front line is 1,000 kilometers long, but the bases, the sort of engineering depots where you can do this are several hundred miles back from the front line. So, in fact, in a perfect world, if it was a Mercedes-Benz or a Rolls-Royce, it'd be easy. You go into the garage, you change something, you'd be out again. Unfortunately, that is not the reality of the war we're seeing in Ukraine. You need to be able to sort it out in situ, not miles away.
And of course, I suppose that this is then some of the defence planning assumptions. It may be that there are defence planning assumptions that we would be able to take that capability into the field, and that's built in. But that works for a short war and not for a long war.
Entirely, and I think that is the key to it. What are you planning for? And in a very static war we're seeing in Ukraine, you can't afford to take this out of the field.
So what are the lessons for us? Because one of the things that I'm thinking and hearing here is maybe a more blended fleet.
I mean, there are lots of lessons, but there is the reality of resources, whether you can sort them out. When we look at numbers, we're only going to get 148 Challenger 3s. That on the casualty rates in Ukraine will last a couple of weeks. We want to fight more than a couple of weeks. So it may be a blend. It may be something different. It may be more. It may be some sort of different type of capability. On the maintenance side, well, we all want things to work all of the time. And one would hope now that the Challenger 3s have been made by Rheinmetall, who are the German tank manufacturers who actually make Leopard 2, you sort of intuitively think they're going to be more reliable, but that might not be the case. And when it comes to protection, the holy trinity of tank design is about firepower, protection, and mobility. The protection is something that we haven't focused on as much as perhaps we should. And I think Ukraine is telling us that we need to put more effort into protection than perhaps we do on some of the other elements.
And by protection, you mean more those defensive aids rather than adding more armour?
Entirely. Yeah. If your £5 million tank has been taken out by a $500 drone, you need to do something serious to make sure that it can't be taken out by a $500 drone.
You spent, a lot of time in tanks, including in Iraq. If you were on the battlefield in Ukraine right now, what kind of tank would you want to be in? Would it be a Russian T-series? Would it be a Leopard 2?
That's a great question. I spent many thousands of hours on a Challenger 2, which I think I would still choose. But I would want to make sure that it had the right defensive aid suites, because a lot of it is how you use things, how you train. And tanks should not be looked in isolation. It's about combined arms maneuver warfare. So I'd want to make sure I'd supported by sufficient air power, sufficient artillery, sufficient drones. I want my drones supporting my tank being a counter to what the enemy is producing. Yeah, I would still choose Challenger 2, mainly because I know it intimately rather than anything else. I like the protection from direct fire that it has, and it's very familiar for me. But I'm sure you ask 10 tank commanders and they'd all give you a different answer. But I certainly wouldn't choose a Russian tank.
Really good to get your thoughts. Always good to see you. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
I mean, Mike, if you're fighting in Ukraine, having a tank is better than not having a tank. They cannot do anything about the numbers of Challengers or Leopard 2s they've got. They can't do anything about the repairability. could they realistically be making better use of them, which I think is, is what some of the commentary has suggested, is they're using them wrong?
Yes, and I think Hamish at the end of that interview there put his finger on it in a way. He said it's combined arms warfare and air power in particular, because the answer for Ukraine is that they've got to use their tanks in a more combined way. I mean, they were doing that to some extent, but not across the whole front as far as we could see. But their biggest lack is air power. Remember that in 2023, they tried a major offensive, a major strategic offensive on 2 or 3 places at once without air superiority. And as I was saying at the time, we would never try that. If we were involved in this war, I wouldn't say we wouldn't dream of it, but we would only do it in extreme circumstances, because unless you've got air superiority, you really can't offer your tanks enough protection from other tanks. And so that's if I could give, wave a wand and give the Ukrainians one wonderful wish on the battlefield, it would be far more air power, much greater air power.
So you're saying they don't have the kit to have that air power, rather than they're not exercising it properly?
Yes, I mean, they did what they could with what they had in 2023. They could have used it differently. They were urged to go earlier, even though they before they had the forces fully built up. We now know that their Western advisors, particularly the British, were saying, go now while the Russians are off balance. You will have to take a chance. You will have to be innovative. You will have to be brave, but do it now. And the Ukrainian high command, they held back until they had the numbers. But by the time they had all the numbers, the Russians had dug in very strongly in the Surovikin line, all those massive minefields that they then couldn't get through. And there was some frustration, I think, in the Ministry of Defence, which has now become public. I remember some of us heard about it at the time, that the Ukrainians were being too cautious. They wanted too much equipment, whereas the Western style of warfare is to be, fast, manoeuvre, take chances if necessary, be bold. And the Ukrainians were not very comfortable with that. And when it came to the big push, they weren't good enough at combined arms warfare. But critically, they lacked air power. And that was the thing that was so, in a way, not predictable about it, but was so disappointing from their point of view. I thought to myself, gosh, if this works without air power, they will be setting new standards in military history.
Simon, you've met Ukrainian troops who've been using Challenger. I don't know if you met ones who've been using Leopard 2 as well. From what I recall when you spoke to us about that, they were pretty positive about having these Western tanks compared to the other options.
We met them. We met the 82nd Air Assault Brigade near Kursk, who were using Challenger and used it on that incursion. They love the tank. They love the gun. It's called the sniper tank for a reason. They love the armor. We go talking about what Hamish was saying. These tanks have great survivability compared to the T-72s that a lot of these crews had trained on previously when they were in the army. But they would also say, we saw these tanks, they were dug in a forest, and they would say to us they're just too heavy. The Challenger 2 is 65, 70 tons. It gets stuck in the mud in the rainy season in Ukraine, and that's why they were having to use them in that way, as they have had to do with the Leopard 1 as well. I think what Hamish is saying, the issues are that for instance, he talks about, you need to repair them in the field. That's all very well and good if you've got a kind of REME support system, which they don't have, and you don't have Lancet drones overhead all the time ready to pick you off. I mean, the tank we saw, for instance, the guys we were with, they said they'd taken it out of this wood block just momentarily 2 days earlier and been hit by 2 glide bombs within half an hour of them actually getting into the open air. So they were spotted by reconnaissance drones, and that's what they're having to actually deal with. And this is why they're taking these Leopards back to Lithuania to fix his engines. I looked into this. It's very interesting. And actually, of the 1,200 or so tanks that Ukraine has lost, only about I think 17 Leopard 1s I read and 38 Leopard 2s have been lost. So around a fifth of the 250 Leopards that the Ukrainians have had from the Germans and other countries as well. So, and if you compare that to the figure, as Hamish said, 4,000 Russian tanks, lost. That's about 100 a month throughout this war. So that the Leopards, the survivability for the crews particularly is something they really have liked, because of that 50, I don't know the figure, but I am guessing the number of crew members who've been killed in those is far less than it would have been for the Russian crews who've lost their lives as well.
Okay, let's look forwards again, and the equipment that has just been pledged as Ukraine tries to take this war forward and stay in the fight. You had the allies in the Defence Contact Group meeting just under a week ago, and the total of the new pledges said to be a record, about £18 billion worth. I mean, Simon, just kind of give us an overview of what that's going to deliver to Ukraine and when.
Well, so the main bulk of it seems to be coming from German money, and it's German kit. It's 100,000 artillery rounds. They're sending more Marder IFVs, about 25 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, another 15 tanks, presumably Leopard 2s, radars, manpads. There's also some more RST air defense systems going, and some missiles. So I think it's about 11 billion of that is being sent from German money between now and 2029. That's the kind of pledge. And then in the mix also is about 450 million pounds of UK money, UK and Norwegian money, which is going to pay for what they're calling a kind of close fight package, which is things like anti-tank mines, radars, and lots of drones. And also importantly, they're giving about 160 million to the Ukrainians to what we've just been talking about, really, to try and repair vehicles on the front line, to give them that sort of support, things like Challenger as well. So we're seeing this aid package ramp up, obviously, in light of what's happening with the American aid dwindling and this increase in European support. In terms of the timeline, that's really kind of unclear really as to when this is all going to be delivered, particularly because the Americans have now pulled out of Rzeszów in Poland, this logistics hub in the east of Poland that's been used throughout the war as a kind of funnel for all the kit going into Ukraine. And the Americans pulling out of there is a big blow. They were obviously the biggest force there. The Brits do have some logistics teams there as well, but it was predominantly American. They've now gone, so we don't quite know how that's going to affect the speed and the reliability of those deliveries.
And Mike, it's easy for the top line numbers and the lists to sound impressive, but in terms of the difference it's going to make for Ukraine in the fight, is it simply, keeping the status quo, or does it offer them an option to potentially change the momentum?
No, it keeps Ukraine in the fight for longer if they find that they've got no alternative but to keep fighting, which is the track I think that they're on at the moment. In the more likely event that a truce or a ceasefire is not agreed or is not possible, then their only option is to keep on fighting. The problem with this is that the Ukrainians need more of everything. They need more across the board. And as Simon said, when you describe the things they've got, what they are getting, in a sense, is what we've got to give rather than what they most need. So they're getting everything that we can push through that we've got to offer, as against their shopping list of what they need immediately. And it's sort of a balance between, they need a lot more air defence, they need the ability to withstand, to be more resilient, and we offer systems that do that. But in a way, they're taking what we offer rather than we are feeding what they need, simply because the drawdown in American equipment is pretty severe and it is fairly debilitating. And the Europeans are, I wouldn't call this bits and pieces. It's far more important than that. But they're making up in an ad hoc way the bigger numbers that the Ukrainians are losing now the Americans are pulling out.
So let's bring all this together then, Mike. Given where we are, while diplomacy remains ineffective, what possible paths can you see forward in this war? Because from the conversation we've had, all I'm hearing, it seems to be realistic possible paths is Ukraine continues to lose slowly.
Well, if they keep on fighting, is probably the story for the rest of the year. Although I don't think the Russians would make such big gains. I still don't think they would break through strategically anywhere if things carry on as they are. But it is possible, of course, that there will be some sort of ceasefire. It will be an unstable ceasefire. And it will keep breaking down in lots of places. And the big variable in all of this is, does anybody else play a role in it? Do the Europeans get involved in Ukraine in some way to reassure, to guarantee some sort of ceasefire, even, and we wouldn't have said this a year ago, to run some sort of no-fly zone, in effect, to start to give the Ukrainians some sort of air power, being able to use their own air power in more aggressive ways because Western air forces operate their defensive air power. I mean, that's plausible. Whether it would happen or not, we don't know. So there's 2 or 3 lines that they might go down, but one of the lines that we're not likely to go down is a stable, agreed ceasefire anytime soon.
I mean, Simon, in terms of the fighting, when you look at what each side is doing, as you do every day, can you see anything in there that shows how Russia and Ukraine might each be trying to take this war forward, what their strategy is?
I mean, I echo what Mike says. I think there's no signs that Russia seriously wants this ceasefire. They're still making these extreme demands about the Ukraine handing over these 4 oblasts and abandoning its NATO ambitions, which are enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And the whole narrative, denazification, that all remains exactly the same. You've got Putin issuing an order to draft another 160,000 men into the army, and all at the same time, Ukraine's losses of civilians and children, as we've seen in Sumy, are all going. So I thought Zelensky's 60 Minutes interview was really interesting. I think you saw that on the CNN, which was talking about actually inviting Trump to come and visit Ukraine, come and see for himself what is actually happening. You imagine if that happened. It probably never will, but if that happened, that could change things completely, because this is Donald Trump we're talking about. So, Russia is banking on Ukraine just becoming desperate, on dragging this war out, the West losing interest. So at the moment, as we sit here, I think it's very difficult to see how things are going to change. And it just, the Russians took 100 square kilometers, I think it was, last month or so. The difference being now that previously the Ukrainians were managing to take back this, there was a sort of exchange going on. That's not happening. So you've got this nibbling away by the Russians along this 1,000-kilometer, 800-mile or so front line. And I can't see that stopping at the moment, particularly when they're talking about the Russians having 70,000 troops on the border near Sumy, ready to go in some sort of spring offensive. We don't seem to be moving forward particularly.
At this point, Mike, all the Western will in the world is we can't really practically put Ukraine in a leading position, can we now?
Not unless we're a great deal braver, and some would say more reckless than we've been prepared to be so far, because, going back to what I said earlier, in effect, the United States has changed sides in this whole conflict. And the idea that Ukraine represents the front line in a deeper struggle between the powers of autocracy and dictatorship as opposed to democracy and the values of the West Europeans, that argument doesn't wash at all with the current American administration. And so what the Europeans can do in response to that is relatively limited. One could imagine if this war carries on during the year, one could imagine other things, big things that might change during the course of the year, which might change the picture. But those are only things you can hope for, and hope is not a strategy. You can only strategize on what you see as a trend in front of you. And the trends at the moment all look fairly negative. One final point on that is that the NATO summit, when it comes up, and I'm sure we'll be doing quite a lot on it, on the 24th, 26th of June, that will be an absolute humdinger, because it will crystallize a whole series of issues on Ukraine, on the Middle East, on Iran, on the future of NATO, all within this, what could be a very, very hot 2-day meeting where the United States and the Europeans, whatever they say in the communique, face the parting of the ways on a whole series of issues.
Yeah, words are having as much impact as weapons in all this, aren't they? Mike, thank you so much. Really good to talk to you. Simon Newton, thanks for joining us as well. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke will be reunited with Kate Chabot for another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. There you can read more from Simon analysing the performance of weapons like the Leopard 2 tank, and also more from Hamish de Bretton-Gordon about the lessons for the British Army from Ukraine's experiences with those modern tanks. From me, James Hirst, though, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye for now.